The good news: he ruled for 60 years. The bad news: about 20 of those years came with more mood swings than a teenager on energy drinks. Welcome to the reign of King George III, Britain's infamous Mad King. But before we picture him wandering palace halls in a nightgown, raving about invisible armies, it's worth stepping back and remembering, George wasn't born mad. In fact, he was once Britain's golden boy. George III came to the throne in 1760. A fresh-faced 22-year-old with a surprisingly wholesome reputation. Unlike his Hanoverian predecessors, who often treated England as a side project while pining for Germany, George was determined to be a proper English king. He spoke English fluently. His grandfather, George II, still preferred German, and he made a point of presenting himself as a model of morality and domestic virtue. In an era when kings were expected to collect mistresses the way nobles collected hunting dogs, George married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz and shockingly remained faithful. Yes, this was a monarch who actually believed in sticking to his vows, practically scandalous by royal standards. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, the bizarre hobby of King George III, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Early on, George seemed poised to be the stable, family man monarch that Britain didn't know it needed. He and Charlotte had 15 children. Apparently, fidelity doesn't mean moderation. He was deeply involved in their upbringing and made Windsor into a kind of royal family home rather than just a ceremonial palace. Picture him less as a distant ruler on a gilded throne and more as a father herding his children around like an exhausted schoolteacher on a field trip. But George's reign was anything but uneventful. He presided over wars, revolutions, and enough parliamentary squabbles to fill entire seasons of a political drama series. Perhaps most famously, he was king when Britain lost its American colonies. Yes, the Declaration of Independence of 1776 had a very pointed finger at him, listing all the reasons the colonists thought George was a tyrant. To many Americans, George became the boogeyman of monarchy, the distant despot across the sea who taxed their tea and sent his redcoats to trample liberty. To the British establishment, though, George wasn't a villain, but rather a symbol of stability in a rapidly changing world. It's easy to forget that the man called Mad King George was for much of his reign a fairly competent monarch. He worked closely with Parliament, took his duties seriously, and wasn't afraid to voice his opinions on matters of state. He resisted Napoleon, held Britain together through the turbulence of the French Revolution, and managed to keep his sprawling empire afloat even after the disaster in America. In other words, he wasn't just babbling nonsense while chewing on curtains, as the myths sometimes suggest. So where did the madness come in? By the 1780s, George began suffering bouts of mental illness that baffled his physicians. During these episodes, he would talk endlessly, often incoherently, and seemed unable to control his racing thoughts. He could become agitated, paranoid, and display what we might now recognize as symptoms of mania. There's still debate among historians and medical experts about the cause. Some point to porphyria, a rare blood disorder. Others argue for bipolar disorder. Whatever the diagnosis, the impact was undeniable. His condition disrupted government. When George suffered an especially severe breakdown in 1788, he became so incapacitated that Parliament had to debate whether to establish a regency under his son, the future George IV. This was no small matter. Transferring power from an incapacitated monarch without deposing him outright was a constitutional headache. Imagine trying to explain to the public that yes, the king was technically still the king, but also not really. Despite his episodes, George had long stretches of lucidity. He could bounce back and govern with the same attentiveness as before. This duality, competent monarch on one hand, deranged figure on the other, cemented his reputation as both tragic and bizarre. By the early 19th century, though, his illness became more persistent and debilitating. After 1810, following the death of his beloved daughter Princess Amelia, George's mental health collapsed entirely. He lived the final decade of his life blind, largely incoherent, and locked away in Windsor Castle, while his son ruled as Prince Regent. The contrast between the man George III wanted to be and the image that history remembered is stark. He strove to be seen as a stable family man, a king who loved his country, his wife and his children, yet the lasting image is one of madness, the king who ranted, rambled and lost touch with reality. It's almost Shakespearean, the monarch who aspired to moral uprightness but was undone by forces beyond his control, both political and personal. And here's the irony. For all his so-called madness, George III reigned longer than nearly any British monarch before him, beaten only by Queen Victoria and Elizabeth II. 60 years on the throne is a remarkable feat, madness or not. If nothing else, he proved that insanity does not necessarily shorten one's career, though it might make the ride bumpier than most. So before we dive into George's bizarre hobby, it's important to keep this in mind. He wasn't just the mad king, he was a complex ruler, a devoted husband and father, a man who cared deeply about his country and occasionally lost his grip on reality. In the grand ledger of monarchs, George is less a caricature of lunacy and more a tragic reminder that kings too are mortal, fallible and sometimes very unwell. But enough about war, politics and madness. Let's move from the battlefield to the tool shed, because George III had a hobby that was frankly stranger than fiction. Some kings built empires. George III built spreadsheets. Well, the 18th century equivalent anyway. If you were to peer into the mind of George III, you wouldn't just find royal ambitions and political calculations. You'd also discover a man who loved order so much that he could have happily spent his days cataloguing socks by color, size, and emotional importance. George wasn't content with merely owning things. He had to organize them, categorize them, and if possible arrange them in neat rows with precise labels. His contemporaries often remarked on his unusual level of detail-oriented thinking. Most monarchs were satisfied with trophies of conquest, glittering jewels, gilded palaces, or perhaps the odd vanquished enemy's head on a pike. George, by contrast, found satisfaction in methodical record-keeping. He didn't just want possessions, he wanted knowledge about them. It wasn't just a royal quirk. George was born with a deep intellectual curiosity. He consumed books like a student preparing for exams no one asked him to take. He studied languages, dabbled in music, and took a keen interest in science. But where others might have absorbed these pursuits as passing entertainments, George had a collector's instinct to systematize them. If information could be written down, indexed, and cross-referenced, he was there, quill in hand. His personal library became legendary. While many monarchs were content with a few shelves of philosophical musings and family chronicles, George assembled one of the greatest collections of books in the English-speaking world. By the end of his life, he had amassed over 65,000 volumes covering everything from history to botany to obscure scientific treatises. And of course, they weren't just stacked haphazardly. Each book was meticulously catalogued, sorted and organized, the kind of precision that would make even modern librarians nod in approval. It wasn't enough to simply possess knowledge. George wanted it arranged. The man essentially weaponized filing. This wasn't just the product of idle boredom either. The Enlightenment was sweeping through Europe, and George was determined not to be left behind. Knowledge wasn't just a personal pleasure, it was a statement of modern kingship. To be a monarch in the late 18th century wasn't only about military prowess, it was about showing you were in step with reason, science and order. George's compulsive cataloguing then was part of a broader intellectual culture, but where most kings dipped their toes, George dove head first and started alphabetizing the ocean. One gets the sense that George might have thrived in today's world of spreadsheets, databases, and online shopping carts organized into neat lists. Imagine him downloading Excel, color-coding his columns, and staying up until 3 in the morning because he noticed his metadata on shovel 478 was slightly inconsistent. In an age when kings were expected to lead armies, George might have been happiest leading an army of index cards. And yet there's something undeniably human about this compulsion. Who among us hasn't gotten lost in the black hole of reorganizing a bookshelf, a record collection, or even a digital photo album we swore we'd deal with later? George's collecting instincts weren't so alien. He just had the resources of a monarch and the persistence of a man who really liked tidy shelves. But here's where George differed from your average hobbyist. He didn't merely collect for private satisfaction. He often imagined that his collections would serve future generations. His library, for instance, wasn't intended to gather dust in Windsor Castle. It was meant to be a resource. In fact, after his death, much of it formed the foundation of the British Library, a rather grand outcome for what began as one man's obsession with stacking and labelling. This dedication to collecting also seeped into his interactions with others. George was the kind of man who would corner a guest and bombard them with detailed facts about his newest acquisition. Imagine being a visiting noble hoping for a polite chat about foreign alliances, only to endure a 2-hour lecture on the precise Latin naming system for fungi. Courtiers sometimes found him tedious, but he wasn't doing it to annoy anyone. For George, sharing catalogued information was an act of enthusiasm, not vanity. He wanted others to see the order and detail he saw. At times, his love for detail bordered on the pedantic. He could be painstaking in discussions, parsing minutiae that others glossed over. His letters reveal an obsession with accuracy, whether in spelling, facts, or political statements. Even when debating policy, he leaned toward methodical precision rather than sweeping rhetoric. Other rulers thundered and inspired. George counted, noted, and underlined. What made George's collecting instinct bizarre, at least to some of his peers, was how far it deviated from expected royal behavior. Kings were supposed to embody majesty, grandeur, and the occasional lavish eccentricity. Collecting art was acceptable. It suggested taste, amassing jewels. Perfectly fine, it suggested wealth and power. But methodically cataloguing thousands of books, tools, or objects in painstaking order, that suggested something else entirely. A monarch who was perhaps more clerk than conqueror. Yet therein lies the strange charm of George III. His obsession with order reflected his deeper worldview, the belief that the world could and should be understood through careful study and systematic thought. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. In a way, George wasn't just collecting objects, he was collecting understanding, piece by piece, page by page, shovel by shovel. So yes, some kings built empires, George built spreadsheets, but perhaps that's why his legacy feels so unusual. He wasn't remembered for flamboyant displays of extravagance, but for the painstaking labor of a man who believed the universe could be measured, catalogued, and placed neatly on a shelf. And while it may not sound majestic, it made him one of the most oddly relatable monarchs in history. Proof that even kings can be nerds. Other kings collected jewels, George collected shovels, which tells you a lot about cocktail parties at Buckingham. When people imagine royal collections, they think of glittering treasures, priceless art, or at the very least a taxidermied tiger lurking in a gilded hallway. But George III, ever the curveball monarch, filled his private storerooms not with gemstones or ancient artifacts, but with farm equipment. Yes, the most powerful man in Britain spent his free time collecting and cataloguing thousands of ploughs, rakes, hoes, and scythes. You can picture it now. Visiting dignitaries politely nodding as the king excitedly displayed yet another shovel, while silently wondering if they should have stayed home. The sheer scale of this hobby was astonishing. George didn't just own a few curious items picked up from passing farmers. He amassed an arsenal of agricultural implements, carefully stored and documented as though they were crown jewels. From the latest iron plough designs to obscure seed drills, he wanted them all. His collection wasn't about quantity for its own sake. He genuinely cared about each piece as an object of study. Every shovel had a story, every rake had a reason, and George was determined to preserve them. Why tools, though? What could possibly be so exciting about a rake? For George, farming represented something pure, essential, and deeply fascinating. Agriculture wasn't just about dirt and seeds, it was the backbone of society. Bread, beer, wool, meat, all of it began in the soil. Unlike court life, which was full of scheming ministers and foppish aristocrats, farming felt grounded, quite literally. Collecting farm tools wasn't creepy to George, it was noble. Tools were symbols of human ingenuity, the quiet heroes of civilization. Without a hoe, there's no harvest. Without a scythe, there's no bread. Without a plough, well, good luck feeding an empire. Still, to others, the sight of their monarch gleefully cataloguing pitchforks felt odd. It wasn't the collecting itself. Royalty had always been hoarders of one kind or another, but usually those collections were designed to impress visitors, not confuse them. A jewel-encrusted crown says, "I am powerful." A collection of hoes says, "I can weed an allotment like nobody's business." Not exactly the statement most monarchs wanted to make. The oddity lay not only in what George collected, but in how he collected. He approached each item with the seriousness of a curator. Tools were not tossed into a pile. They were classified, measured, and sometimes displayed as though they were rare antiquities. He treated a spade with the same reverence others reserved for medieval manuscripts. To George, there was no hierarchy between a Rembrandt and a rake. Both were products of human craft. Imagine being invited into the royal storeroom. Rows upon rows of ploughs lined up like soldiers on parade, hoes dangling from racks, seed drills polished and positioned as if waiting for a museum opening that never came. The atmosphere must have felt less like a royal treasury and more like the world's fanciest hardware store. Instead of gasping at priceless treasures, visitors had to smile politely while the king extolled the ergonomic virtues of a particularly well-balanced scythe. This wasn't a passing eccentricity either. George dedicated decades of his life to amassing and refining this collection. The hobby didn't fade with age or the pressures of rule. If anything, it grew. His cabinets of tools reflected not only a curiosity about agriculture, but also a desire to document technological change. Farming was advancing rapidly in the 18th century, with new inventions promising to make planting and harvesting more efficient. George wanted to capture that progress in steel and wood. Every new design was a piece of history, and he wanted it preserved. It would be easy to laugh at George's obsession, and many did. Contemporary satirists lampooned his creepy preoccupation with tools. Political cartoonists depicted him as more farmer than king, a man happier with a spade than a scepter. Courtiers sometimes whispered that the king's interests were unbecoming of royalty. After all, monarchs were supposed to elevate themselves above the dirt, not dive headfirst into it. But George didn't care. Where others saw eccentricity, he saw importance. And perhaps in his own way he was right. Tools are history in miniature. They tell the story of human survival better than any jewel-encrusted crown. A plough can reveal as much about a civilization's values as a marble statue. George's collection was, in some ways, a museum of humanity's most vital achievements, minus the glamour plus a lot more mud. Still, one has to wonder how this looked to outsiders. Imagine being a French diplomat arriving in Britain during tense negotiations, only to be dragged by the king into a storeroom of spades. Yes, monsieur, but have you seen the curvature of this ploughshare? It was by all accounts a royal passion that bewildered more than it impressed. So here we have it, the bizarre hobby of King George III, a man who could have basked in jewels, relics and treasures, chose instead to surround himself with farming tools. He elevated the humble hoe into a royal artifact and the rake into a collector's gem. Was it creepy? A little. Odd? Absolutely. But it was also sincere. George's collection wasn't meant to dazzle, it was meant to understand. Other kings wanted to be remembered as conquerors, lawgivers, or patrons of the arts. George, he wanted to be remembered as the guy with the best shovel collection in Europe. And honestly, that's a legacy no amount of diamonds could outshine. Imagine you're a farmer ploughing your field, sweat dripping down your brow, when suddenly the King of England shows up and starts asking you detailed questions about your manure. Not your taxes, not your loyalty to the crown, your manure. Welcome to the world of George III. Affectionately, and sometimes mockingly nicknamed Farmer George. While other monarchs preferred lavish balls, endless hunts, and the occasional ill-advised war, George found his joy in the rhythms of agriculture. He wasn't content to admire fields from the carriage window. He wanted to be in them, boots muddied, hands examining soil, eyes narrowed at the structure of wheat stalks. Farming wasn't a side interest, it was an obsession. For George, the smell of freshly tilled earth was every bit as thrilling as the glitter of the crown jewels. The nickname Farmer George stuck for a reason. He immersed himself in the agricultural revolutions of his age. The 18th century wasn't just about powdered wigs and fancy waistcoats, it was also an era of dramatic advances in farming. Crop rotation, selective breeding of livestock, improved irrigation, and the development of more efficient machinery were transforming how Europeans fed themselves. For Britain, a nation teetering on the edge of industrialization, farming was the silent engine that kept everything running. George knew it, and he wanted in. He devoured reports on crop experiments. He studied soil composition. He debated the merits of Norfolk's four-course crop rotation system versus more traditional approaches. This wasn't idle dabbling either. George applied what he learned to the royal estates. He introduced new breeds of sheep, experimented with fertilizers, and encouraged innovative techniques in ploughing and sowing. While most royals were preoccupied with maintaining their dignity, George was busy calculating the best way to coax an extra bushel of wheat out of Windsor's fields. His enthusiasm often baffled his courtiers. These were men trained in the subtle art of flattery and political maneuvering, not in conversations about turnips. But George would happily corner a duke and launch into an animated discussion about the latest improvements in drainage systems. One can almost hear the forced laughter and the whispered complaints. "Did you hear? The king spent 20 minutes describing compost again." If the courtiers were bored, the farmers themselves were probably just bewildered. It wasn't every day that the monarch himself strolled into your field, crouched down in the dirt, and demanded to know the exact ratio of dung to soil you were using. To George, this was not beneath him, it was essential. His conversations with farmers weren't for show. He respected their expertise and saw them as partners in the shared project of feeding the nation. In his eyes, a farmer with muddy boots might know more about the future of Britain than a powdered aristocrat in silk stockings. George's agricultural zeal also had a practical purpose. Britain's growing population needed reliable food sources, and the stability of the kingdom depended as much on bread as on muskets. Famines and food shortages could lead to unrest. By throwing himself into the study and improvement of farming, George believed he was safeguarding his nation's future. In an odd twist, his hobby doubled as a form of governance. His hands weren't just in the dirt for fun, they were in the dirt for Britain. Of course, that didn't stop the public from finding it amusing. The nickname Farmer George could be affectionate, but it was often used sarcastically, a way of poking fun at a monarch who seemed more interested in turnips than treaties. Satirists painted him as a simpleton, a king who preferred the barnyard to the battlefield. Yet, even these jokes couldn't erase the fact that he took genuine pride in being seen as a man of the land. In some ways, he embraced the nickname, better a farmer than a tyrant. The royal estates became testing grounds for new agricultural techniques. George didn't hoard his findings, he encouraged their spread. Improvements that worked on his land could be shared with the wider farming community. His role wasn't just collector or dabbler, he became something of an agricultural ambassador. The image of a king poring over seed catalogues and wool yields might seem ridiculous, but his genuine commitment lent it an odd dignity. Perhaps what made George's farming passion most unusual was how it blurred social boundaries. Monarchs usually towered over their subjects both literally and figuratively. They lived in gilded bubbles, detached from the daily struggles of common life. George, however, bridged that gap, at least in spirit. By valuing farming, he was valuing the labor and knowledge of the very people who kept the country alive. While aristocrats saw the land as a source of rent, George saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a science to be mastered, and an art to be perfected. It's hard not to smile at the mental image, a king standing ankle-deep in mud, cape forgotten, quizzing a farmer about the merits of clover. Courtiers sigh, diplomats roll their eyes, but George beams. This was his element. If ruling the empire was his duty, farming was his joy, and in his stubborn, manure-obsessed way he managed to fuse the two. So yes, he was Farmer George. To some, that meant a simple-minded monarch who wasted time on turnips. To others, it meant a king grounded in the earth, invested in the well-being of his people. Either way, it made him one of the most unusual monarchs Britain ever had, a king who saw more promise in a fertile field than in a gilded throne room. Let's imagine you've just inherited the British throne. You have wealth, prestige, and armies at your command. Some monarchs before you built extravagant palaces, others filled their vaults with diamonds the size of goose eggs. George III? He filled his shelves with hoes, and no, not the scandalous kind, actual farming hoes, the sort that spent more time in the mud than in polite society. Welcome to the strangest royal collection in history, King George III's Tool Museum. Yes, it existed, and yes, he was proud of it. Picture it. Halls lined not with fine portraits or gilded mirrors, but with neatly labelled agricultural implements. Ploughs sat like prized sculptures, sickles hung as if they were religious icons. Scythes, those long, menacing blades usually associated with the Grim Reaper, were treated with the same reverence other monarchs gave to crowns and sceptres. It was less Versailles, more Home Depot. This wasn't just random clutter. George wasn't tossing rusty pitchforks into a heap like a medieval yard sale. No, he organized them, painstakingly. Each item had its place, its tag, its entry in his ever-growing catalogue. Imagine rows of rakes sorted by region, year, or blade angle. Some kings made military museums to celebrate conquest. George made a museum that could terrify weeds. George III had the soul of a librarian trapped in the body of a monarch. To him, a collection wasn't worth much unless it was meticulously documented. So he did what any self-respecting 18th century monarch with far too much free time would do. He catalogued everything. Measurements, materials, provenance. If a scythe had been wielded by Farmer John of Sussex, George wanted it noted. His system was so detailed that modern historians marvel at the sheer dedication. He wasn't dabbling, he was building an agricultural archive. Today, we'd call it data-driven farming. Back then, it just looked like a king getting suspiciously excited about hoe handles. Let's linger on those rakes for a moment. Imagine a visitor strolling into this royal gallery. You expect to see priceless tapestries or perhaps a marble bust. Instead, you're confronted with an entire wall of rakes lined up like soldiers, teeth gleaming in the torchlight. It's both impressive and mildly terrifying. Step on one, and instead of a peasant prank, you've accidentally assaulted the king's prized possessions. It's not hard to picture George proudly guiding guests through his collection. Ah yes, this rake was used during the Great Turnip Harvest of 1764. Notice the craftsmanship. Exquisite, isn't it? The guests probably nodded politely, all while wondering if the king had finally lost it. On the surface, this might look like eccentricity spiraling into madness, but there's something deeper here. To George, tools were symbols of progress, innovation, and the dignity of labor. Britain in the 18th century was transforming. New farming methods were fueling population growth, rural landscapes were shifting, and the seeds of the Industrial Revolution were sprouting. His collection wasn't just about tools, it was about documenting the backbone of the nation. It's almost poetic. While his courtiers obsessed over wigs and politics, George obsessed over the implements that kept bread on the table. He didn't just want to rule farmers, he wanted to understand them. And what better way than by surrounding yourself with the very objects that shaped their lives? Of course, the idea of a royal tool museum was unusual. Even in an age of eccentric aristocrats, this stood out. You have to wonder what foreign dignitaries thought when visiting. Imagine being a French ambassador expecting a lavish tour, only to be shown a room full of hoes and spades. Behold the pride of Britain, George might have said, while the ambassador muttered something about how Paris at least had wine cellars. It wasn't exactly the kind of cultural flex monarchs were known for. Napoleon displayed armies, George displayed rakes. One could argue both men had sharp points, but in very different ways. From today's perspective, the whole thing feels almost comical. We can't help but laugh at the image of a monarch beaming over a plough as though it were the Hope Diamond. Yet, behind the absurdity lies an oddly endearing truth. George genuinely cared. For him, this wasn't creepy. It was earnest. He saw beauty and importance in the ordinary, elevating the common farmer's tools to objects of royal attention. It's the sort of collection that would make modern museum curators blink twice. A gallery of hoes might not draw crowds today, but in George's time, it was his passion project. And honestly, there's something charming about a king who preferred hoes to jewels, rakes to rubies. So yes, Britain's monarch once presided over what might have been the world's most intimidating rake collection. It may not have impressed his contemporaries, but it gives us a vivid portrait of his quirks, his priorities, and his determination to elevate farming into something noble. After all, not every royal legacy can sparkle with diamonds. Sometimes it shines through the polished wood of a well-kept hoe. The good news, no one ever doubted his commitment. The bad news, if you tripped in his museum, you'd probably impale yourself on a pitchfork. To understand George III's bizarre hobby, you have to zoom out a little and remember the intellectual climate of the 18th century. This was the Enlightenment, the age when thinkers, tinkerers, and eccentric gentlemen in powdered wigs decided the universe could be understood with a combination of reason, observation, and a frankly unhealthy amount of curiosity. People were charting the stars with telescopes, peering into microbes with microscopes, and dissecting frogs with the kind of glee usually reserved for parties. Against this backdrop, George's obsessive collection of farm tools might look strange to us, but in his mind he was part of a grand tradition, the king as amateur scientist. This wasn't a monarch who shrugged at intellectual trends. George backed astronomy and even owned telescopes himself, marveling at the heavens like an 18th century Neil deGrasse Tyson. Though one with considerably stiffer posture, he supported botany, sending explorers across the globe to bring back exotic specimens, seeds, and knowledge to enrich Britain's growing empire of plants. He was deeply invested in agricultural innovations, promoting crop rotation and new farming techniques that helped push Britain's food supply toward modern efficiency. When he leaned over a plough or examined a rake, it wasn't only eccentric, it was part of the same inquisitive mindset that drove scientists to ask why planets move the way they do. The Enlightenment gave humanity the steam engine and the foundations of modern medicine. George, meanwhile, gave Britain what might be called the Louvre of hoes. It's easy to laugh at the contrast, but in fairness, his hobby really did reflect Enlightenment values. Cataloguing tools, documenting their design, and arranging them in methodical order was exactly the kind of rational systematization Enlightenment thinkers adored. Carl Linnaeus classified plants, George Cuvier would later classify fossils, and George III, bless his royal heart, classified rakes. It was all part of the same impulse. If you understand the parts, you understand the whole, and if you understand the tools, you understand the work that sustains society. Of course, there's a thin line between scientific curiosity and obsession. When you hear that George carefully documented the angle of scythe blades or the curvature of a plough handle, you might wonder whether this was pure rationality or something a touch more personal. The Enlightenment celebrated reason, but George's brand of reason had a distinctly muddy-booted flavor. To his courtiers, telescopes felt noble, microscopes impressive, but a museum of shovels? That pushed the limits of polite admiration. They might have nodded approvingly, but it's safe to assume most were silently thinking, perhaps His Majesty should spend a little less time with hoes and a little more time with politics. And yet, this wasn't madness. Not at this stage. It was curiosity pushed into unusual territory. In some ways, George was ahead of his time. Today, scholars take great interest in material culture, studying the tools of everyday life to understand how societies functioned. George was doing that in real time, albeit without the benefit of modern academic jargon. To him, a rake wasn't just a rake, It was a symbol of labor, an artifact of rural innovation, a clue in the puzzle of how to feed a nation. The Enlightenment wasn't only about lofty theories, it was about practical improvements too. George simply decided to enshrine practicality with the reverence most monarchs reserved for jewels. The humor lies in the juxtaposition. Imagine Enlightenment salons buzzing with talk of electricity, natural rights, and the motion of planets. Then imagine George puffing with pride, chiming in, "Yes, yes, fascinating. But have you seen the latest Sussex hoe design? It's like everyone else was playing intellectual chess while George was proudly unveiling his complete set of garden trowels." He wasn't wrong to be curious. It's just that his curiosity pointed him toward manure rather than metaphysics. Still, we can't dismiss this as simply weird. It reveals something crucial about George's personality and the time he lived in. He embodied the Enlightenment's hunger for order and knowledge, but he filtered it through his own obsessions. Where others saw stars and atoms, he saw turnips and rakes, and he thought both deserved equal respect. If the Enlightenment's motto could be summed up as "dare to know," George added, "and dare to hoe." The good news is that his hobby wasn't destructive. It didn't drain the treasury or start wars. In fact, it probably made him more sympathetic to the working people who actually used those tools. The bad news is that while the Royal Society was experimenting with electricity, their king was busy curating an exhibition that could double as a barnyard sale. But perhaps that's what makes him so fascinating. Instead of towering above his subjects, he grounded himself literally in the soil of their labor. So while the Enlightenment gave us telescopes, microscopes, and revolutions in thought, George III gave us the world's first shovel museum. And honestly, that feels like a very Enlightenment thing to do. When most people think of George III, the first word that comes to mind is mad. It's an unfortunate label, really, because his reign was long and not nearly as chaotic as that nickname suggests. But toward the later years of his life, the king did begin to suffer from severe mental health crises that alarmed both his court and his country. Theories abound as to what actually caused his breakdowns. Some historians argue that he suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can trigger everything from stomach pain to confusion and hallucinations. Others say it was more likely a form of bipolar disorder or another psychiatric condition that medicine at the time simply couldn't explain. Either way, the man once admired as Farmer George for his grounded curiosity suddenly became the monarch who was decidedly unmoored. Now, if you're picturing a king tearing through the palace, raving about conspiracies or talking to imaginary courtiers, you're not far off. But with George, there was always a twist. Even during the height of his madness, when his speech grew erratic and he couldn't control his thoughts, his mind circled back to farming over and over again. While other rulers in history lost themselves to paranoia about assassins or religious visions of grandeur, George had visions of manure management and crop rotation. Nothing says mentally unwell monarch like pacing Windsor Castle at 3 in the morning while ranting about soil acidity. To his courtiers, this was disturbing in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Here was their king, the supposed embodiment of reason and stability, babbling about the moisture levels of hay while frothing at the mouth. They tried to listen respectfully at first. After all, George was still the king, even if his conversations now sounded like the world's least helpful farming almanac. But it quickly became obvious that something was very wrong. Imagine being a servant tasked with attending to him in these states. You're woken in the dead of night because the king insists the fate of the nation depends on discussing the precise angle at which a plough should cut through clay soil. You nod and agree while secretly wishing you'd gone into bookkeeping. Courtiers trained to deal with diplomatic crises suddenly found themselves dealing with manure lectures on loop. There was a sense of helplessness about it. You couldn't argue with him, you couldn't redirect him, and you certainly couldn't laugh, even though the situation was often bizarre beyond belief. Part of what unsettled people most was the way his farming obsession endured even when everything else unraveled. Memory gone, judgment impaired, coherence vanished. No matter, somehow the seed drills and crop yields still lived rent-free in his mind. It was as though the hobby had rooted itself so deeply in his identity that even illness couldn't weed it out. His fixation became both a marker of his past eccentricities and a cruel reminder that the king was slipping beyond the reach of ordinary reason. Medical treatments at the time didn't help much. Doctors believed in things like bloodletting and blistering, essentially torturing the patient with the hope that pain might shock them back to sanity. Spoiler, it didn't. And through it all, George muttered about his fields. The poor man endured excruciating cures while still clinging to farming talk like a lifeline. It was both tragic and, in its own way, oddly consistent. The king who built a museum of hoes was still the same man, only now his devotion to agriculture echoed through his madness. To the public, stories of his breakdowns were both horrifying and darkly comedic. Pamphlets and whispers spread, exaggerating tales of their king obsessed with manure at inappropriate hours. Imagine reading in your local coffeehouse paper that while Britain faced political turmoil, its monarch was busy rambling about the benefits of clover in crop rotation. It wasn't a great look for royal authority, yet the gossip also made him seem strangely human. His suffering was real, but his fixation was so peculiar that people couldn't help but treat it as a grim curiosity. From a modern perspective, we can see how his agricultural mania acted as a sort of anchor for someone losing his grip on reality. Farming talk gave him a thread of continuity, a way of holding on to something familiar. Sadly, that thread wasn't enough to stop the unraveling of his mind. His episodes grew more frequent and severe, until by the end of his life he was nearly blind, deaf, and permanently unfit to rule, locked away from the public eye. Yet, even then, the shadow of Farmer George lingered. He was remembered not only as the king who lost America, but as the king who in his darkest hours still wanted to discuss turnips. The tragedy of it all is how his obsession shifted from endearing to eerie. When he was healthy, his farming hobby was charming, if a bit odd, proof that a monarch could care about ordinary people and their work. When he was sick, the same hobby became unsettling, a sign that the rational Enlightenment king was gone, replaced by a man trapped in looping conversations about soil. What once made him relatable now marked his decline. The good news? George left behind a legacy that showed he genuinely cared about agriculture, even if he took it to extremes. The bad news? He also showed just how disturbing it can be when obsession meets madness. After all, if the king is shouting about compost in the middle of the night, it's not exactly a reassuring image of national stability. When George III leaned into his agricultural obsession, he may have thought he was showing Britain that their monarch was a man of science, curiosity and practical wisdom. To some, he was exactly that, a king who cared about the soil, the plough, and the farmers who kept bread on the tables of his kingdom. To others, however, George's hoe collection and tool cataloguing were less enlightened ruler and more eccentric neighbour you politely avoid at the village fair. Public opinion on Farmer George was as divided as the furrows in a freshly ploughed field. For the common people, there was something almost heartwarming about the king's interest in farming. Monarchs were usually aloof, draped in jewels and removed from everyday life. George, on the other hand, seemed genuinely invested in the daily struggles of farmers. Here was a man who could stroll into a field, chat with a ploughman about soil quality, and actually know what he was talking about. To those who tilled the land, it must have felt like a rare bridge between the throne and the furrow. He wasn't a distant symbol of power, he was a monarch who understood manure ratios. That earned him a degree of affection among some rural folk who may have thought he might be king, but at least he knows his way around a turnip. But the aristocracy and the political class were far less charmed. For them, George's tool museum and his fascination with crop rotation were hardly befitting of a king. Nobles wanted their monarch to exude majesty, not manure. They expected elegance, not lectures on rakes. To their eyes, George's farming mania looked simple, too simple. A ruler who preferred hoes to diamonds, who collected spades instead of commissioning new palaces, seemed less like a sovereign and more like a gentleman hobbyist who had wandered into Buckingham Palace by mistake. This perception was fertile soil for satire. and Britain's satirists didn't waste a moment. Cartoonists gleefully pounced on the image of a monarch digging around in the mud, while Europe burned with revolution. Caricatures depicted him as Farmer George, hoe in hand, fussing over crops while ignoring matters of state. It was the 18th century equivalent of political memes, except hand-drawn and sold in coffee houses instead of retweeted. And just as memes can define public figures today, these cartoons solidified George's identity. He was no longer just the King of Great Britain, he was the King of Turnips. The press had a field day with him too. Pamphlets, broadsides and satirical essays painted him as eccentric to the point of foolishness. They mocked the contrast between his rustic obsession and the grandeur expected of monarchy. The joke practically wrote itself. While Louis XVI of France was busy losing his head, George III was busy losing his rake count. It was the sort of quip that stuck because it perfectly highlighted the absurdity of the situation. Across the Channel, thrones were toppling and revolutions were raging, while in Britain, the king was trying to perfect his hoe collection. That said, public satire always carried a dual edge. While it mocked him, it also made him oddly relatable. Unlike the aloof monarchs of Europe, George became a figure people could laugh about, even poke fun at, without fearing the wrath of a tyrant. In a sense, being ridiculed as Farmer George was better than being feared as George the Despot. His eccentricities humanized him, and though laughter may have undermined his dignity, it also softened his image. A king obsessed with manure wasn't threatening, he was peculiar but approachable. Of course, this did little to reassure the political elite. To Parliament, Farmer George was a liability, not an asset. In their view, a monarch should inspire awe, not appear as if he were about to roll up his sleeves and help with the hay harvest. They wanted their king to embody imperial strength at a time when Britain faced challenges abroad, not to get lost in the details of plough design. Every rake catalogued was in their eyes another sign that George wasn't focusing on the grander stage of world affairs. Foreign observers, too, picked up on the oddness. Diplomats whispered about the eccentric King of Britain, a ruler who seemed more interested in manure than maneuvering. Some likely found it refreshing, others ridiculous. Either way, Farmer George became part of his international reputation, an image that stood in stark contrast to monarchs like Frederick the Great or Napoleon, who built their legacies on military genius. Yet perhaps the most telling reactions came from ordinary Britons in the cities, who were far removed from farms. To them, George's obsession seemed quaint at best and bizarre at worst. Many urban dwellers swept up in the early industrial changes saw farming as something outdated, a reminder of the old world they were leaving behind. In that light, the king's fascination with hoes and shovels looked less like curiosity and more like a refusal to move with the times. So was George admired or mocked? The answer is both. To some, he was the humble monarch, who cared about the land. To others, he was the eccentric Farmer George, more suited to a barn than a throne. He straddled the line between down-to-earth and downright ridiculous, admired for his sincerity, but laughed at for his obsessions. And in that strange middle ground, he became one of the most unusual figures in Britain's long royal history. The good news? Being Farmer George made him more beloved than feared. The bad news? It also made him look more like a punchline than a king. Still, if your choice is between being remembered as a tyrant or as the man who loved turnips a little too much, perhaps the rake collection wasn't such a bad legacy after all. When George III finally departed this world in 1820, after decades of illness and seclusion, he left behind more than just the image of a mad king or the monarch who lost America. He also left a peculiar legacy of rakes, hoes and scythes, his tool collection. His carefully catalogued shrine to British agriculture didn't vanish with him. It endured, scattered across institutions, estates and museums, becoming a strange historical footprint of his royal curiosity. Kings are usually remembered through monuments, military campaigns or diplomatic triumphs. George III, on the other hand, left the world the royal equivalent of a home depot. The fate of his collection was mixed. Some of the tools remained within royal hands for years, their provenance carefully noted, others slipped into obscurity, dispersed through sales or gifted away, their royal origins forgotten until rediscovered by historians. Today, a number of George's agricultural treasures can be found in museum collections, their once practical iron and wood transformed into artifacts of cultural history. They sit behind glass, no longer for digging turnips, but for reminding us that a king once treated them as objects of national importance. Visitors may stroll past Napoleonic medals or dazzling royal jewels, only to find themselves staring at a centuries-old rake that George himself once admired with scholarly delight. What's remarkable is how the memory of Farmer George persisted long after his death. The nickname, originally meant as a sneer, took on a dual character. To some, it remained a jab at his eccentricity, an eternal reminder that Britain's king seemed more comfortable fussing over manure than managing international diplomacy. To others, though, it became almost affectionate. Here was a monarch who, for all his faults, showed genuine interest in the lives of ordinary farmers. While most kings were remembered for battles and treaties, George was remembered for his affection for the soil. The legacy may have been odd, but it was also strangely humanizing. It's telling that later historians often leaned into the Farmer George identity when writing about him. His political record was complicated. He presided over the loss of the American colonies, suffered intense mental health struggles, and lived through decades of shifting British politics. Yet the enduring image is not of defeat or instability, it's of a king in muddy boots, poking at soil with genuine enthusiasm. That, in itself, says something about how history chooses its symbols. George could be mocked, yes, but he could also be admired for the very same trait. He blurred the line between ruler and eccentric uncle at the garden allotment. The legacy of his hobby also lingered in cultural memory through satire and storytelling. Long after his death, playwrights, authors and cartoonists continued to use Farmer George as shorthand for a monarch out of step with grandeur. In an age when Britain was becoming an industrial superpower, the image of a king who cared more about ploughs than power remained both comic and quaint. Even today, when George III appears in pop culture, there's usually a wink to his oddities, his madness, yes, but also his muddy preoccupations. A crown sits on his head, but the shadow of a rake is never far behind. In a broader sense, George's hobby also reflected a legacy of valuing science and material culture. His obsessive cataloguing foreshadowed the Victorian mania for museums and classification. The Victorians would later enshrine everything from fossils to postage stamps in vast collections, but George had already done it with hoes and spades. His passion looked strange in his own time, but in hindsight it feels like an early echo of Britain's later love affair with cataloguing the world. The difference, of course, is that the British Museum proudly displayed the Rosetta Stone while George proudly displayed the Sussex hoe. And let's not forget the humour baked into this legacy. Centuries later, schoolchildren and history buffs alike still snicker when they learn that Britain's monarch was less Alexander the Great and more Alexander the Great Gardener. Instead of tales of conquest, we remember him for tool shelves. Instead of dazzling statesmanship, we recall his fascination with soil acidity. The good news is that this makes him one of the most memorable monarchs in British history. The bad news? He is memorable for reasons that would have horrified his more dignified ancestors. Yet perhaps that is precisely why his legacy endures. In a long line of monarchs obsessed with power, prestige, and pageantry, George's creepy little hobby stands out. It gives him texture, making him feel less like a gilded statue and more like a flawed, quirky human being. He was a king who battled illness, bore heavy political responsibility, and yet still found solace in cataloguing rakes. That detail, however absurd, makes him unforgettable. So, centuries later, George III isn't remembered primarily for Waterloo, that was his son's era, or for winning great victories on the continent. He isn't celebrated for diplomacy or feared as a tyrant. Instead, he's the king with a rake collection, the monarch who turned agricultural tools into royal treasures, the sovereign whose Home Depot legacy outlasted his crown. It's strange, it's funny, it's tragic, and it's what makes him one of the most peculiar figures in royal history. The good news? His bizarre passion kept his name alive in the public imagination. The bad news: he'll always be remembered less as George the Wise and more as George the enthusiast. When history gives us kings, it usually gives us archetypes. There are the warrior kings, covered in blood and glory; the tyrants, remembered for cruelty and iron fists; the reformers, reshaping nations with laws and revolutions; and then, on a shelf somewhere between the crowns and the plows, there's George III. He doesn't quite fit any of those categories. Instead, he's the monarch who taught us that sometimes the grand theatre of royalty has room for a king who was, essentially, a nerd with a spade. George's obsession with tools, farming, and agricultural science does more than make for good trivia. It reveals something about the human side of monarchy. He wasn't untouchable marble or gilded iconography. He was a man with hobbies, interests, and a cataloguing system that might put modern librarians to shame. And that humanity is what makes his story both strange and oddly relatable. It's easy to mock the idea of a king who knew more about manure than geopolitics. But it's also hard not to see the appeal of a ruler who found joy in something so grounded, so earthy, so ordinary. Unlike monarchs remembered for dramatic battles or scandalous affairs, George's legacy carved itself in quieter soil. His reign was long, his politics messy, his health tragic, but through it all, his peculiar affection for agriculture threaded its way into how people remembered him. It was a departure from the grandeur expected of rulers. He didn't aim to leave behind colossal statues or marble halls lined with heroic depictions. Instead, he left a memory of catalogued rakes and conversations with bemused farmers. In its own way, that left a mark just as enduring as monuments, because we remember George III not as an untouchable sovereign, but as an oddly specific human being. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson. History tends to smooth out individuals into types: the conqueror, the villain, the martyr. George III refuses that neat categorization. He was a king plagued by mental illness, defined by political upheaval, and yet also remembered for his soil-stained boots. That complexity is what makes his story more interesting than the usual royal resume. He was flawed, eccentric, tragic, and endearing all at once. He reminds us that rulers, for all their crowns and titles, are still subject to quirks, passions, and the occasional obsession with home maintenance. Compared to his contemporaries, George's legacy shines differently. Louis XVI, his French counterpart, is remembered for guillotines and revolutions. Frederick the Great of Prussia is remembered for military brilliance. Catherine the Great is remembered for power plays and empire building. George III? He's remembered for cataloguing spades. It might not sound impressive, but in some ways it's more approachable. His eccentricities gave him a cultural afterlife that feels less like distant mythology and more like the kind of anecdote you'd tell at a dinner party. Did you know Britain once had a king obsessed with rakes? It sticks in the memory precisely because it's so absurd. And maybe that's the bigger picture. We don't only remember rulers for their victories or defeats. Sometimes what endures are the quirks, the oddities, the deeply human eccentricities that sneak past the grandeur of history. George III's hobby turned into his brand. Whether he liked it or not, he'll forever be Farmer George, the king who preferred manure to monarchal theatrics. That makes him strange. Yes, but it also makes him one of the most relatable monarchs Britain ever had. So the next time you feel awkward about your coin collection, your love of model trains, or your strange tendency to alphabetize your spice rack, take comfort. At least you're not a monarch with an agricultural implement fixation. George III carried that honor, and for better or worse, it earned him a place in history that no crown jewel ever could, because in the grand tapestry of royal memory, some kings shine through military triumphs, some through political reform, and some through sheer, unstoppable weirdness. George III belongs proudly to that last group. His crown may have slipped, his empire may have fractured, but his rake collection, immortal. So, next time you feel weird about your stamp collection, just remember at least you're not a king with a hoe fetish. Picture yourself in London around the mid-19th century. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Steam engines are puffing, factories are booming, and people are moving into cities like moths to a very sooty flame. The population is exploding. London alone swelled from about 1 million people in 1800 to over 3 million by 1860. That's not just growth, that's an urban population on steroids. And with more people comes more traffic, more chaos, and let's be honest, way more smells than a human nose should ever have to process. The good news? Horses were still the dominant mode of transport. The bad news? Horses also produce, let's say, byproducts. And when you have hundreds of thousands of them clip-clopping down narrow medieval streets, you don't just get congestion, you get literal mountains of manure. In fact, one 1894 prediction claimed London would be buried under 9 feet of horse droppings within 50 years. Spoiler, it didn't happen, but only because humans decided to dig down instead of drown in dung. The streets were a battlefield. Horse-drawn carriages jostled with omnibuses, carts, wagons and pedestrians who had the audacity to believe that legs were a valid transportation system. Crossing a street wasn't just a walk, it was a survival challenge. If the horses didn't trample you, the wheels might clip you, and if you were unlucky, you'd step into something that required an immediate change of boots. And while all of this was happening, the city was blanketed in thick industrial smog, so even if you survived the traffic, you might still cough yourself into oblivion. This was the grand paradox of progress. Cities were getting bigger, richer, and more powerful, but daily life was starting to resemble a slow-motion disaster. Getting across London by carriage could take hours, and the distance wasn't that far. The traffic jams were so notorious that Charles Dickens himself complained about them. You know things are bad when even Dickens, a man famous for writing about misery, is like, "This is too much." And let's not forget public hygiene wasn't exactly a strong point of the era. Imagine being crammed inside a horse-drawn omnibus, wedged shoulder to shoulder with 20 other people who haven't discovered the joys of modern soap or deodorant. The good news? You can get across London in a carriage. The bad news? It'll take 3 hours and you'll arrive smelling like the horse did all the work. By the 1850s, the problem had become impossible to ignore. London's population density was suffocating. Businesses suffered because workers couldn't commute efficiently. The wealthy were moving farther away, out into the suburbs, but there was no quick way to get from suburban home to city office. And city planners who up until this point had been content to widen streets, add more bridges and shake their heads, realized that surface solutions just weren't cutting it. You could only pack so many carriages onto a street before you had something less like transportation and more like a parking lot with motion sickness. Enter the radical idea, what if, instead of building more roads on the surface, you built beneath it? To most people, it sounded absurd. Digging under a major city? Running trains in tunnels? That wasn't progress, that was a Jules Verne novel. But engineers and visionaries were starting to toy with the concept. Cities, after all, were already full of underground things. Sewers, crypts, hidden rivers. If you could bury London's waste underground, why not its traffic? It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how revolutionary the idea was. We're so used to subways today that we don't think twice about stepping onto an underground train. But in the 1850s, the thought of descending below the earth to travel was unsettling. People associated underground spaces with death, darkness, and general unpleasantness. Going underground meant either you were dead, you were hiding, or you were up to something shady. Suggesting that respectable men and women commute underground was like suggesting they all spend rush hour in a haunted house. And yet the need was undeniable. The city couldn't keep expanding its roads forever. Something bold had to be done, and the underground, as crazy as it seemed, was starting to look like the only real solution. That's the thing about human history. Most breakthroughs don't come because someone had a genius idea while sipping tea. They come because life had gotten unbearable, and the alternative was worse. Londoners were tired of endless traffic, constant manure, and losing hours of their lives just trying to get from point A to point B. If you wanted to reach your office before retirement, you needed a miracle, or in this case a tunnel. So the stage was set. Engineers were sharpening their pencils, politicians were reluctantly opening their wallets, and the public, well, they were skeptical, but they were also desperate enough to give it a shot. After all, when your daily commute smells like horse and despair, even the idea of riding a train underground starts to sound appealing. What followed would be one of the most audacious engineering experiments of the century, the birth of the world's first subway system. But before that miracle could happen, the Victorians had to answer one very important question. How do you convince millions of people to willingly climb into a dark, smoky hole in the ground and trust that they'll come out alive on the other side? By the early 1860s, London had decided it had two options: drown in horse manure or gamble on a plan that sounded suspiciously like a death wish. That plan was the Metropolitan Railway, the very first subway in human history, which opened in January of 1863. Think about that for a second. No one had ever seen anything like it. The idea of riding a train underground wasn't just radical, it was terrifying. Victorians were already wary of steam engines in the open air. Now they were being asked to ride one in a tunnel beneath the city. So how did it come to be? Enter Charles Pearson, a lawyer and social reformer who thought London needed more than just street-widening projects and a stiff upper lip. He had been pushing the idea of underground trains since the 1840s. Everyone thought he was insane, but Pearson had persistence, and the kind of Victorian optimism that believed no problem was too big if you threw enough bricks and labourers at it. Eventually Parliament agreed, and digging began in the late 1850s. The construction method was called cut and cover. Sounds polite, but it was basically surgery on the city. Workers dug massive trenches straight through neighbourhoods, tore up roads, demolished houses, and then roofed it all over with brick arches before piling the streets back on top. It was chaos. Streets turned into craters, businesses complained about lost customers, and Londoners grumbled about the noise, dust, and the small matter of their houses being torn down. But Pearson's vision carried on. If Londoners were going to get a subway, the city was going to look like a war zone first. After years of upheaval, the Metropolitan Railway finally opened on January 10, 1863. It ran just under 4 miles, connecting Paddington to Farringdon. On paper it looked simple. In reality it was revolutionary. This was the world's first underground urban railway. People were curious, people were nervous, and people showed up in droves on its very first day. Over 30,000 passengers took a ride, a number that proved two things. 1. Londoners were desperate for quicker travel, and 2. People will risk almost anything if it saves them time. Now, here's the part where Victorian logic really shines. To run trains underground, the Metropolitan Railway used steam locomotives. Yes, steam. The exact same smoke-belching beasts that filled the skies with soot were now being stuffed into tunnels. It was like trying to fix a leaky roof with more rain. But in 1863, electric trains weren't an option yet, so steam it had to be. Imagine stepping into one of those early trains. The tunnels were dim, lit by flickering gas lamps. The air was thick with coal smoke, steam, and the faint whiff of damp brick. As the locomotive chugged forward, the tunnels filled with haze. Imagine a sauna, but instead of eucalyptus steam, it's coal smoke and regret. After a few minutes, your eyes watered, your lungs burned, and your clothes smelled like you had just rolled around inside a fireplace. And yet, people loved it. They genuinely did. For all the discomfort, the Metropolitan Railway was faster than fighting through the clogged streets. That 4-mile trip took about 18 minutes, which was nothing short of miraculous compared to the alternative. Commuters who had once wasted hours in gridlock could now glide beneath the chaos, emerging sootier but significantly earlier. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some passengers were terrified that the tunnels would collapse. Others worried they'd suffocate in the smoke. There were rumors that prolonged exposure to underground travel could damage your health, or worse, your soul. One satirical newspaper even suggested that traveling under London was a good way to meet the devil in person. But for the thousands who crammed onto the trains daily, practicality beat superstition. The Metropolitan Railway quickly became a sensation. The novelty of riding underground made it almost an attraction in itself. People dressed up to take a ride, treating it like a grand social outing rather than just a commute. Middle-class Londoners in top hats and fine dresses packed into carriages alongside workers and clerks. It was one of the few places in Victorian society where class lines blurred. Everyone, rich or poor, could cough together in a cloud of coal smoke, and the numbers kept climbing. Within its first year, nearly 10 million passengers used the line. By the standards of the day, that was staggering. Clearly, London had stumbled onto something, a smoky, eye-watering something, but progress nonetheless. It's worth noting, though, that not all of London was thrilled. Residents whose homes had been destroyed during construction remained bitter. Shopkeepers complained that customers avoided areas near the trenches, and the trains themselves, while faster, were anything but luxurious. Hot in summer, suffocating in winter, and noisy year-round, the Underground was not for the faint of heart. But convenience always wins. People decided they'd rather arrive sweaty and sooty than not arrive at all. In hindsight, the Metropolitan Railway was both a triumph and a half measure. It proved underground transport could work, but it also highlighted the flaws of steam-powered travel. Coal smoke underground wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Engineers started dreaming of better solutions, but those would come later. For now, Londoners were content to embrace the future, even if it smelled like a chimney. The success of 1863 set off a chain reaction. Other cities were watching closely, some with admiration, others with disbelief. But one thing was clear: the age of the subway had begun, and London had taken the first smoky plunge. The world's very first commuters had chosen to trust a train in a tunnel, and they didn't suffocate. Spoiler, they made it to work on time. If you think your morning commute is depressing, spare a thought for the Victorians staring into a freshly dug tunnel in 1863 and wondering if it doubled as the express lane to hell. Because while the Metropolitan Railway may have opened to great fanfare, it also opened to a tidal wave of skepticism, superstition, and sheer terror. Let's face it, the Underground had a branding problem. Above ground meant light, life, and civilization. Underground? Darkness, dirt, and things with more legs than anyone wanted to count. The idea of voluntarily going into a tunnel wasn't just unusual, it was borderline suspicious. People had spent centuries avoiding dark holes in the ground for very good reasons: collapsing roofs, poisonous gases, the occasional plague pit. Suddenly, engineers were asking them to pay money to go inside one. That's not progress, that's a horror story with a ticket booth. Public fears ranged from the practical to the downright supernatural. The practical: what if the tunnels caved in? London's soil wasn't exactly famous for its stability, and many assumed that entire streets might one day vanish into a yawning sinkhole, taking trains, passengers, and unfortunate lampposts with them. Then there was the smoke problem. Early passengers worried that prolonged exposure to coal fumes underground would suffocate them, or at the very least, shave a decade off their lives. Congratulations, they thought, you made it to work in 20 minutes, but you're also now part chimney. The supernatural fears were even juicier. For centuries, the underworld had been associated with the devil, demons, and all things sinister. Newspapers poked fun at the idea, joking that Beelzebub himself had been issued a season ticket. Next stop, eternal damnation, please mind the gap. Some clergymen whispered about the moral dangers of spending time underground, as though Satan was lurking in the tunnels, ready to tempt commuters away from their God-given duty to arrive late to work like everyone else. And let's not forget the rat problem. Rats had always been comfortable underground, and now humans were barging into their territory. This gave rise to one of the funniest observations of all. Nothing says progress like willingly going where rats already live rent-free. To many, it felt less like a railway, and more like a poorly disguised rodent relocation program. Of course, newspapers had a field day with all this. Satirical cartoons depicted trains being swallowed by the earth, or passengers transforming into soot-covered goblins as they emerged from tunnels. Some writers mocked the entire project as a passing fad, predicting that once the novelty wore off, Londoners would scurry back to their omnibuses. Others claimed the underground was fundamentally unnatural. Why? Because humans were meant to walk under the sun, not rattle through smoky burrows like moles in top hats. And yet, and this is the delicious contradiction, curiosity was a stronger force than fear. For every gloomy headline about subterranean doom, there were 3 curious Londoners lining up to see what all the fuss was about. Skeptics might mutter about Satan, but their neighbours were already buying tickets, and once those neighbours came back alive, if a bit smokier than usual, the skeptics started to waver. After all, if Mrs. Jenkins from across the street could survive the tunnel, maybe it wasn't quite the abyss after all. Ridership, instead of collapsing under the weight of bad press, grew rapidly. People discovered that while the underground was dim, dirty, and vaguely terrifying, it was also fast. You could either spend an hour dodging horse carts on Oxford Street, or spend 20 minutes riding under them. Fear loses a lot of its bite when efficiency is on the line. In fact, early passenger reports were a bizarre mix of terror and delight, like describing a roller coaster that might also give you lung disease. One delightful detail: some Victorians actually treated their first underground ride as a kind of dare. Groups of friends would buy tickets together just to see who flinched first when the train plunged into darkness. Others described the experience in almost romantic terms, as if they had briefly visited another world, a dark, noisy, sulphur-scented world, but still something new. For a society obsessed with novelty, the underground quickly became irresistible. Still, the fears never fully went away. Even years after its opening, rumors circulated about ghosts haunting the tunnels, about entire trains vanishing into the earth, and about mysterious illnesses caused by subterranean vapors. Were any of these real? Absolutely not. Did they stop Londoners from gossiping about them? Absolutely not. Because if there's one thing more powerful than fear, it's the Victorian love of a good rumor. What's fascinating is how quickly skepticism gave way to acceptance. Within just a few years, what had once seemed unholy became merely inconvenient. Londoners who once fretted about collapsing roofs now complained instead about late trains. The devil didn't appear in the tunnels, but delays certainly did, and for many that was punishment enough. So while the Metropolitan Railway may have been born in smoke and fear, it also proved something important. People can get used to almost anything, as long as it gets them to work on time. Even Satan's alleged express line turned out to be just another part of daily life. By the time the novelty wore off, the underground wasn't creepy anymore. It was just crowded. Once London proved that you could dig a hole, shove a train in it, and not immediately doom humanity, the rest of the world perked up and thought, "We'll have some of that, please." By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities across the globe were tripping over themselves to build their own underground railways. But here's the fun part. Every city came with its own set of problems. Some fought nature, some fought politics, and some fought their own citizens. Because, let's be honest, building a subway isn't just engineering, it's urban chaos with a shovel. Take New York City, for example. London might have been the first, but New York was determined to be the loudest. The first section of the New York subway opened in 1904, and it was huge compared to London's modest little line. New York didn't do small. They blasted out an entire network from the start, stretching nearly 10 miles. True to form, the opening day was treated less like public transport and more like a parade. Half the city seemed to cram into the tunnels just to say they were there, but New York had to deal with a uniquely American challenge: water. Lots of it. Digging underground in Manhattan meant constantly battling flooding, leaks, and rivers that seemed personally offended at being disturbed. At one point, workers joked that they weren't digging a subway so much as installing an accidental aquarium, and if the water didn't get you, the corruption did. The project was plagued by political wrangling, contractors cutting corners, and the occasional scandal. But when the trains finally rolled, New Yorkers didn't care. It was fast, it was big, and most importantly, it was theirs. Meanwhile, Paris was having its own underground adventure. The Paris Metro opened in 1900, perfectly timed for the Exposition Universelle, a world fair meant to show off how modern and cultured France was. But unlike the gritty practicality of New York, the Parisians decided their subway should be stylish. After all, this was the city of art and fashion. Why should the underground be ugly? Architect Hector Guimard designed those iconic Art Nouveau entrances, curling ironwork that looked like nature itself had sprouted ticket booths. Riding the metro wasn't just about transport, it was about aesthetic. Of course, style didn't stop labor disputes. Parisian workers staged strikes during construction, arguing over pay, safety, and who got to swing the biggest pickaxe. Progress was slow, arguments were loud, but the result was undeniably French, a subway system that was both functional and fashionable. New York gave you speed, London gave you smoke, but Paris gave you subway entrances. So beautiful, you almost forgot you were about to spend the next 20 minutes in a tunnel. Budapest, surprisingly, beat Paris to the punch in one regard. In 1896, it opened the Millennium Underground Railway, making it the second oldest metro system in the world and the first on the European continent. Hungary wanted to celebrate its 1000th anniversary in style, and nothing said modern nation like a brand new underground line. Unlike London's coal-smoked caverns, the Budapest line was elegant and electric from the very beginning. The stations had tiled walls, gold accents, and an atmosphere that made you feel less like a commuter and more like a guest at an underground ballroom. Budapest may not have had the global prestige of Paris or New York, but in subway bragging rights it was ahead of the curve. Then there was Berlin. Leave it to the Germans to turn subway building into a masterclass in efficiency. The first Berlin U-Bahn opened in 1902, and while other cities were bogged down by strikes, floods, or scandals, Berliners managed to get the job done with Teutonic precision. They also had a practical advantage. Instead of carving through centuries-old medieval streets, they could plan with a relatively modern urban grid. This allowed them to design their system more logically, rather than the dig here and hope approach that plagued London. Berlin's subways became known for their punctuality and straightforwardness, or, as one might joke, they were the only subways in the world where arriving late was considered an engineering failure, not just daily life. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Boston was busy quietly making history as the first American city to build a subway in 1897, 7 years before New York's. The Tremont Street subway was modest, less about grandeur and more about unclogging downtown streets that were suffocating under too many trolleys. For Bostonians, it wasn't about competing with Europe, it was about survival. Their subway was essentially a glorified tunnel for streetcars, but it worked. And while it lacked the glamour of Paris or the size of New York, it proved that even a relatively small city could go underground and come out better for it. What's fascinating about this global wave is how much each city's personality seeped into its subway. London's was smoky and practical, the stiff upper lip of transport. New York's was massive and chaotic, a steel and concrete symbol of ambition. Paris made theirs chic, Budapest made theirs elegant, Berlin made theirs efficient, and Boston made theirs useful. Building a subway meant convincing citizens you weren't just digging a very expensive hole, but once convinced, each city found a way to make the underground uniquely their own. The truth is, the spread of the subway wasn't inevitable, it was demanded. By the turn of the century, urban populations were exploding worldwide, and traffic had become unbearable. The only way forward, ironically, was down. And while each city cursed its engineers, grumbled about delays and doubted the safety of riding underground, they all ended up embracing it. Because whether you were in Paris, New York, or Budapest, the reality was the same. People wanted to get to work faster, and they were willing to share a dark, crowded tunnel with strangers to do it. By the early 20th century, the subway had gone from bizarre Victorian experiment to global urban necessity. Cities that once laughed at the idea of underground trains now scrambled to build them, and while no two systems looked alike, they all carried the same message. The future wasn't just ahead of us, it was beneath our feet. If the early subway had a motto, it was probably "Congratulations, you've arrived, and so has your lung damage." Steam power, while a marvel above ground, was a suffocating disaster below it. Trains running on coal-fired engines produced enough smoke to make every rush-hour ride double as an involuntary trip through a chimney. For decades, passengers tolerated the conditions because the alternative was battling horse manure and traffic jams above ground. But tolerance doesn't equal enjoyment. Eventually, engineers and passengers alike began to wonder, was there a way to get to work without looking and smelling like a roasted ham? Enter electricity, the miracle child of the late 19th century. While Thomas Edison was busy convincing people that light bulbs weren't sorcery, subway planners saw electric power as their ticket to transforming the underground commute from claustrophobic death sauna to slightly tolerable journey. By the 1890s, electricity was no longer a futuristic fantasy. It was becoming the practical solution cities desperately needed to make subways breathable, efficient, and far less flammable. Before electricity took over, engineers tried to improve steam-powered systems with ventilation shafts, giant fans, and all sorts of Victorian contraptions. Unfortunately, ventilation in practice meant sticking big chimneys along the city streets. Londoners complained that smoke simply relocated from the tunnels into their neighbourhoods. You hadn't truly lived in 19th century London until you'd had coal fumes waft through your kitchen window while trying to eat dinner. Passengers, meanwhile, endured the experience with a mix of stoicism and nose-pinching. Contemporary accounts described the tunnels as filled with a dense fog, though fog is a polite word for what was essentially airborne soot. People emerged from rides with blackened clothes, irritated eyes, and hair that reeked of coal. In other words, Victorian dry shampoo was involuntary ash. By the late 1800s, it was clear steam had to go, but the replacement had to be powerful, reliable, and most importantly, not asphyxiating. Electric trains weren't an overnight invention. They emerged slowly through a mix of bold experiments and skeptics muttering, "This will never work." Werner von Siemens, a German inventor, unveiled one of the first electric railway demonstrations at the Berlin Industrial Exposition in 18. The real breakthrough came with the third rail and overhead wires, systems that could power full-size trains with enough juice to carry passengers without choking them. Electricity wasn't just cleaner, it was also faster, more reliable, and capable of handling the demands of swelling urban populations. Budapest gets bragging rights for operating the first fully electric underground railway in 1896, known as the Millennium Underground. It opened just in time for Hungary's 1000th anniversary celebrations. It was small, stylish, and so ahead of its time that it impressed even visiting royals, who were probably relieved not to inhale soot while wearing their white gloves. London, embarrassed by the smoke-filled Metropolitan Railway, quickly followed. The city's new tube lines, beginning with the City and South London Railway in 1890, were entirely electric. Passengers marvelled at how much less miserable the ride was. No smoke, no choking, just the quiet hum of electric motors, a sound that practically screamed modernity at the turn of the century. And then there was New York. When the Big Apple launched its subway in 1904, it went straight to electricity. The idea of digging fresh tunnels only to fill them with smoke seemed absurd, even by New York standards. The city wanted speed, efficiency, and a way to carry thousands of people daily without needing half of Manhattan to invest in gas masks. The electric revolution didn't stop at the trains themselves. Once cities committed to electricity, they could improve everything else underground. First came electric lighting. Gone were the gloomy gas lamps and flickering candles that made tunnels look like crime scenes in waiting. Electric bulbs illuminated stations brightly enough that you could actually read your newspaper without guessing the headlines. Next came escalators, moving staircases that turned climbing into gliding. Before escalators, passengers had to haul themselves up endless staircases, which was fine if you were a Victorian fitness enthusiast, but less charming if you were in a corset. The first escalators were treated like attractions in themselves. In some stations, people bought tickets not to board trains but to ride the escalator for fun. because nothing says excitement like moving at the speed of a lazy turtle. Ventilation also improved dramatically. Electric systems allowed for better airflow, and fans could be placed strategically without worrying about dispersing coal smoke. Subways still weren't tropical paradises. No one has ever accused the underground of smelling like roses, but at least passengers could breathe without wondering if this was their last gulp of oxygen. The shift from steam to electric wasn't just a technological upgrade, it was the birth of the modern subway experience. The idea that underground travel could be efficient, relatively clean, and maybe even pleasant if you ignored the occasional stranger falling asleep on your shoulder. Electric trains meant schedules could be tighter, stations could be brighter, and tunnels could be longer without suffocating people halfway through. Cities could expand networks massively, carrying millions of commuters daily. By the early 20th century, the subway was no longer an experiment. It was the backbone of urban life. And yes, electricity even improved the fashion situation. No more coal dust turning everyone's outfit into Victorian goth chic. Commuters could arrive at work looking less like chimney sweeps and more like actual professionals. The good news? Subways were now practical and breathable. The bad news? Humanity discovered a new underground hazard, body odor, during rush hour. But that's a problem electricity couldn't solve. By the 20th century, subways weren't just about getting you from point A to point B. They became a stage where cities could show off, and not just in the practical sense of, look, we can now move thousands of sweaty commuters without total chaos, but in the cultural sense too. The Underground Railway turned into an emblem of modernity, progress, and occasionally unapologetic civic bragging. In the industrial age, cities were locked in a game of anything you can build, I can build grander. Paris built the Eiffel Tower, New York raised skyscrapers, and London clung proudly to Big Ben. Subways quickly joined this urban arms race not just as infrastructure, but as architectural and cultural statements. If you wanted to prove your city was forward-thinking, cosmopolitan, and not secretly run by donkeys pulling carts, you needed a subway. And if you wanted to prove your subway was the best, you made it beautiful. Paris, on the other hand, decided that even entering the subway should be stylish. When the metro debuted in 1900, the city hired architect Hector Guimard to design its entrances. The result? Curved ironwork, floral motifs, and flowing green arches in the Art Nouveau style. Step into the metro and you weren't just commuting, you were making an aesthetic choice. Parisians like to think of themselves as refined, and the subway played along, even if the train smelled faintly of garlic and Gauloises cigarettes. At least you began your descent beneath a sculpted sign that looked like it belonged on the cover of a fashion magazine. The metro wasn't flashy like Moscow's palaces, but it didn't need to be. Paris just had to be Paris, graceful, sophisticated, and a little bit showy. Meanwhile, New York tackled the subway with its characteristic mix of ambition and practicality. The system opened in 1904 with tiled stations that were grand but functional, decorated with mosaics, plaques, and colorful insignias. Early stations like City Hall boasted vaulted ceilings, skylights, and chandeliers that rivaled Europe's finest. But New York, being New York, quickly moved on to building bigger, faster, and more interconnected. The system ballooned into the largest in the world, and while City Hall Station remains a jewel box of Beaux-Arts architecture, much of the rest of the network traded elegance for sheer volume. The city's pride wasn't in pretty details, but in scale. Miles of track, hundreds of stations, millions of riders. To ride the New York subway was to feel the heartbeat of the city, loud, chaotic, grimy, and unstoppable. Still, even here the subway shaped civic identity. Grand Central Terminal, though technically not part of the subway system, symbolized New York's obsession with making transport a spectacle. Commuters might start their journey beneath celestial murals in the main concourse before descending into the clatter of trains. In New York, your commute could swing from the sublime to the sardine packed in under 5 minutes. Each city's subway became a mirror of its personality. Berlin's U-Bahn was efficient and punctual, naturally. Tokyo's was disciplined, clean, and capable of moving millions with almost terrifying precision. In Buenos Aires, the Subte opened in 1913 as the first in Latin America, complete with ornate stations reflecting Argentina's desire to be seen as modern and European. Even the materials used carried symbolism. Moscow's marble whispered strength, Paris's ironwork winked with artistry, New York's tiles screamed practicality, sturdy, mass-producible, but still capable of elegance when the budget allowed. And beneath it all, subways quietly reshaped urban life. They became stages for public art, shelters during wars, and canvases for graffiti once spray paint was invented. Whether intentional or accidental, each system carried the cultural fingerprints of its city. For the average rider, the cultural symbolism might not have been top of mind. Most commuters weren't pausing to admire mosaics while sprinting for a train, but the aesthetics mattered anyway. A well-designed subway reminded you that the city wasn't just functional, it had identity, pride, and occasionally delusions of grandeur. In Paris, you descended through wrought iron flowers into tunnels where intellectuals debated philosophy. In New York, you might stand beneath decorative tiles of city seals while munching on a pretzel from a street vendor. Different vibes, same principle. Subways weren't invisible infrastructure. They were cultural landmarks hidden in plain sight. The good news? Your morning commute could now be accompanied by chandeliers, mosaics, or just the smell of hot pretzels, depending on the city. The bad news? None of those things made rush hour less crowded. Today, subways aren't just relics of industrial daring, they are the beating hearts of modern cities. From New York to Tokyo, Paris to São Paulo, millions pour underground every morning like ants into a nest, only with less coordination and more coffee breath. For many of us, the subway is not some exotic marvel of engineering. It's just how you get to work, school, or the dentist you keep meaning to cancel on. And yet, when you take a step back, it's astounding. These tunnels, dug generations ago, still carry the weight of entire cities on their rails every single day. But let's be honest, the daily commute isn't exactly the glossy future engineers once promised. Overcrowding is the universal experience. Tokyo has station attendants whose actual job is to push people into trains, a position that's equal parts engineering solution and human Tetris. In New York, rush hour turns into an Olympic sport of squeezing into cars, balancing on tiptoes, and holding your breath like you're training for deep-sea diving. Subways prove one thing: humans will tolerate anything. Noise, sweat, suspicious puddles, if it gets them to work faster. Delays are another modern plague. Somewhere along the line, subways stopped being symbols of futuristic progress and started being reminders of patience you didn't know you had. A train that was supposed to arrive 2 minutes ago becomes 5, then 10, then we apologize for the inconvenience. Commuters sigh, roll their eyes in unison, and return to pretending they don't see the guy eating a tuna sandwich at 8 a.m. And then there are the smells. Scientists could write dissertations on the mysterious aromas of the subway. They're a blend of hot metal, rubber, damp concrete, and the faint memory of someone's lunch from 3 weeks ago. Every city has its signature scent. Parisian metro has a whiff of ozone and perfume. New York has odor mystery liquid dripping from the ceiling, and London smells faintly of dust and history. It's not pleasant, but it's oddly comforting, a reminder that this is the smell of collective survival. Yet despite all the grime and inconvenience, subways are lifelines. Without them, cities would collapse into gridlock. Try to imagine New York City if its 5 million daily riders all took cars instead. The island would become one giant parking lot, and the Statue of Liberty would be handing out traffic tickets instead of torches. Subways may be flawed, but they are the only way mega-cities function at all. The future, of course, promises improvements. Driverless trains are already operating in cities like Copenhagen, Dubai, and parts of Paris, moving with machine precision and no risk of drivers being late because of traffic, since, after all, they are the traffic. Automation could make subways faster, safer, and maybe even more frequent, though the idea of trusting your life to a ghost train might take some getting used to. Subways are also evolving to be greener. Electric trains, already standard, are being upgraded to run on renewable energy sources. Stations are being redesigned with better airflow, natural light, and even greenery. Some cities experiment with platform screen doors, not just to keep people safe, but also to trap heat and recycle it. The subway of tomorrow might still be crowded, but at least it'll have a smaller carbon footprint and maybe a slightly fresher breeze. Still, the heart of the subway remains the same as it always has been: efficiency. Humanity has proven again and again that we are willing to sacrifice comfort, personal space, and occasionally dignity in exchange for getting somewhere faster. Nowhere else will you see strangers pressed together so tightly that they become a single organism, yet silently agree not to acknowledge each other's existence. It's an unspoken pact of urban life. I won't complain about your elbow in my ribs if you don't complain about my bag in your shin. Looking ahead, the subway stands as a reminder of human ingenuity. The tunnels carved, the systems powered, the sheer audacity of saying, let's move millions of people beneath the earth every day and see if it works. And it does work, even if imperfectly. We put our trust in these machines and these tunnels because the alternative is chaos above ground. The subway is, at its core, a monument not just to engineering but to compromise. It's the daily proof that progress isn't about perfection but about making the imperfect tolerable. The good news? Subways have become the arteries of our cities, connecting lives, jobs, and cultures. The bad news? They will probably always involve sitting uncomfortably close to a stranger who insists on watching without headphones. But maybe that's the real lesson of the subway. Progress is possible, comfort optional. Before the potato chip could ever crunch its way into our snack-loving hearts, there had to be the potato. And let me tell you, the humble spud has a backstory far more epic than any crispy little slice has the right to claim. Long before it became the star of junk food, it was a suspicious root vegetable dragged across oceans, accused of witchcraft, worshipped by empires, and eventually adopted as the savior of European dinner tables. Let's rewind about 7,000 years to the high Andes Mountains of South America. This is potato country, where the Inca Empire and earlier civilizations cultivated an astonishing variety of potatoes, thousands of types in fact. Some were purple, others red, some knobbly, and some small enough to look like something you'd lose between couch cushions. For the people of the Andes, the potato wasn't just food, it was civilization itself. They figured out clever techniques like freeze-drying them in the icy mountain air to make chuño, a lightweight preserved potato product that could last for years. Imagine astronaut food, except 15th century Andean style. The potato gave them calories, nutrients, and the ability to feed armies marching across jagged mountains. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they were far less impressed. Gold? Yes. Silver? Absolutely. Potatoes? Meh. They stuffed a few into their ships anyway. Because even conquerors need snacks. Little did they know they were hauling back to Europe what would become one of the most transformative crops in world history. The potato may not have been shiny, but it was the real treasure. Europe's reaction? Suspicion. This strange underground tuber looked like it belonged in a witch's brew, not a respectable stew. People were cautious. It grew underground like some shady criminal. It wasn't mentioned in the Bible, instant red flag for many, and some folks thought it caused leprosy. Early adopters of the potato sometimes found themselves whispered about. Were they brave innovators, or just reckless root munchers doomed to spots on their skin? Still, the potato had one undeniable advantage. It could grow in places where other crops sulked and died. Poor soil, harsh climates, potatoes didn't care, they thrived. Over time, Europe's appetite began to shift. By the 1700s, the spud had gone from outsider to household staple. In Ireland, potatoes became so dominant that diets centered almost entirely on them. 1 acre of land could yield enough potatoes to feed a family for a year. For the poor, this was a miracle. a food that was cheap, filling, and actually nutritious. For the wealthy it was handy too. Armies fed on potatoes, populations grew, and suddenly Europe had a sturdy new base for its expanding societies. Of course, history isn't kind enough to let the potato off scot-free. Depend too much on one crop and you're setting yourself up for disaster. Case in point, the Irish potato famine of the 1840s, when a blight wiped out potato fields and plunged the country into starvation. Millions fled or perished. The potato, once hailed as a hero, revealed its Achilles heel: monoculture. A single failure meant catastrophe, yet even this tragedy showed just how deeply the potato had embedded itself into society. Without it, the population had grown unsustainably large. With it gone, collapse followed. Meanwhile, in America, the potato had a slightly smoother introduction. Colonists were familiar with it through trade with Europe, and by the 18th century, it had taken root literally across the continent. Thomas Jefferson even served French fried potatoes at the White House. Fancy talk for early fries, proving that even the founding fathers knew a good spud when they saw one. By the 19th century, the potato was no longer just a humble root. It was an international superstar. Empires relied on it to feed their armies. Families relied on it to fill their tables. And scientists praised it as a marvel of agricultural efficiency. Frederick the Great of Prussia even launched a propaganda campaign to convince his skeptical peasants to plant more potatoes. At one point, ordering guards to protect potato fields to make them seem like a prized delicacy. Spoiler, people always want what they can't have, and suddenly potatoes were all the rage. And yet, for all this fame, no one could have predicted that the potato's greatest destiny lay not in saving populations from famine, nor in feeding armies on the march, but in becoming humanity's favorite couchside companion, the chip. The potato was once feared as poisonous, but centuries later, it would become the base of humanity's most sacred food group, junk food. So before we get to the crunchy revenge story that birthed the potato chip, it's worth pausing to appreciate just how far the potato had already traveled. From the frozen peaks of the Andes to the royal kitchens of Europe, from suspicion and slander to survival and salvation, the spud set the stage for greatness. All it needed now was one frustrated chef, one picky customer, and one glorious moment of culinary pettiness to seal its fate forever. Sometimes history is shaped by great wars, noble kings, and groundbreaking inventions, and sometimes it's shaped by a cranky customer who just couldn't stop complaining about his potatoes. Welcome to Saratoga Springs, New York, 1853, the birthplace of the potato chip, where culinary genius met petty revenge in the kitchen of Moon's Lake House. At the center of the story stands George Crumb, a chef with Native American and African American heritage who worked at this popular resort restaurant. Crumb had a reputation for being both talented and stubborn, exactly the sort of personality you'd expect to invent something by accident, while also proving a point. Moon's Lake House was known for attracting the wealthy elite, the kind of clientele who had plenty of money and apparently very little patience when it came to potatoes. One evening, a particularly fussy diner ordered fried potatoes. Simple enough, right? Crumb prepared them, golden and crisp. But the customer wasn't satisfied, they were too thick. Back to the kitchen they went. Crumb made them thinner, still no good. Again and again the plate returned, each time accompanied by the customer's critique. Now, any chef will tell you there are few things more aggravating than someone nitpicking your work, especially when your work involves hot oil and a dinner rush. Crumb had had enough. So, in a moment of frustration or perhaps a flash of brilliance, he decided to make the next batch impossible to complain about. He sliced the potatoes so thin they were nearly transparent, fried them until they were crisp as autumn leaves, and salted them with enough force to make sure nobody mistook them for bland. With the culinary equivalent of a mic drop, he sent them back to the table, and here's where history swerved into delicious territory. The diner loved them. What was meant as a sarcastic joke, the 19th century version of "fine, have it your way," turned into an instant hit. Word spread, and soon other diners were demanding Crumb's crispy little creations. The potato chip was born, Or, perhaps more accurately, the potato chip was spite-baked into existence. The first potato chip wasn't made with love, it was made with spite. And honestly, doesn't that make it taste even better? The chips quickly became known as Saratoga chips, after the resort town where they debuted. Moon's Lake House was already famous as a playground for the rich, and now it had a signature dish that set it apart. Diners traveled for the novelty of eating potatoes that crunched rather than squished. Imagine living in a world where potatoes were always soft, boiled, mashed, roasted, and then suddenly encountering a potato that shattered between your teeth like edible glass. It must have felt like sorcery. For George Crumb, the invention cemented his place in culinary lore, though his relationship with the chips themselves was complicated. Some accounts suggest he later opened his own restaurant and refused to serve them, perhaps tired of being defined by one salty accident. Others argue that his sister Catherine Wicks may have been the true inventor, preparing the first thin slices that night. Like many food origin stories, the details blur between fact and legend, but whether it was Crumb, Wicks, or some combination of the two, what's certain is that the potato chip owed its birth to a kitchen showdown fueled by irritation. And what a fitting invention for America in the mid-19th century. This was a nation already known for improvisation, reinvention, and turning everyday annoyances into opportunities. The potato chip became a perfect reflection of that spirit. Take a problem, a whiny customer, flip it into a solution, crispy potatoes, and walk away with something entirely new. It didn't take long for Saratoga chips to move from restaurant novelty to cultural phenomenon. Wealthy visitors bragged about trying them, cookbooks began to include recipes for them, and the term Saratoga chips became shorthand for a fashionable delicacy. Unlike many foods that start in elite kitchens and struggle to trickle down, the chip had universal appeal. Rich or poor, young or old, everybody could agree on one thing: crispy potatoes were addictive. But let's pause here to appreciate the irony. History's most enduring snack came not from years of careful experimentation, but from a single act of annoyance. It wasn't the result of a food lab, a committee, or a grand design. It was the outcome of one man saying, "Fine, I'll show you thin." It's proof that sometimes the greatest innovations don't arrive with fanfare. They arrive fried, salted, and tossed onto a plate in a fit of exasperation. From that night in Saratoga Springs, the potato chip began its slow but steady march toward global domination. But at this point in the story, it was still a regional oddity, a crunchy curiosity waiting for the right conditions to go mainstream. Nobody, not Crumb, not the diner, not even the potatoes themselves, could have guessed what was coming next. What began as a spiteful joke would evolve into a snack so universally beloved that it would leap from restaurants to factories, from hand-sliced treats to mass-produced bags in every corner store. But for now, in 1853, the world's very first chip crunched beneath the teeth of one satisfied diner, and history's tastiest revenge was served. In the beginning, the potato chip was just a prank gone right, a thin slice of spite served on a silver platter. But word travels fast when wealthy vacationers are involved, and soon Saratoga chips were being talked about in the same breath as mineral baths and fine dining. What started as one diner's stubbornness turned into an upper-class delicacy, proving once again that nothing says sophistication like eating a food invented out of pettiness. By the late 1850s, the reputation of Saratoga Springs as a luxurious summer destination had everything to do with its glittering hotels, gambling houses, and see-and-be-seen atmosphere. The potato chip was swept into that lifestyle as the edible souvenir. Guests who indulged at Moon's Lake House went home bragging not only about the spa waters but about the paper-thin potatoes that crunched like nothing else on earth. In an age when novelty was the greatest luxury of all, the chip became fashionable because it was unusual. Restaurants across New England were quick to notice. Moon's Lake House may have birthed the chip, but imitation was the sincerest form of flattery and also a very profitable move. Other establishments began adding their own version of Saratoga chips to menus, ensuring diners felt they were on the cutting edge of culinary trends. For an era obsessed with refinement, the potato chip had a surprising appeal. It was simple, yet unusual, rustic in ingredient, but delicate in execution. It was the paradox the wealthy couldn't resist. There's something almost comical about this. 19th century diners in formal attire, seated beneath chandeliers, nibbling crisps made from the same humble tuber that fed peasants across the world. Imagine the conversations. "Ah, yes, I've just returned from Saratoga." The waters were invigorating, the company delightful, and the potatoes, so thin, so crunchy. In a sense, the potato chip was the avocado toast of its day, a food elevated not by necessity, but by trend. Of course, once the craze caught on, every chef wanted to put their own spin on it. Some fried them in different oils, others experimented with thickness, and still others tried seasoning variations. But the essence remained, thin, crisp, and dangerously Moorish. The beauty of the chip was that once you'd tried one, you wanted another, and suddenly, an entire basket. It was the culinary equivalent of a magic trick. Potatoes transformed into something almost unrecognizable, light and airy instead of dense and heavy. By the 1860s, Saratoga chips were no longer just a regional fad. They were becoming a recognizable dish throughout the northeastern United States. Cookbooks began to feature recipes for Saratoga potatoes, allowing ambitious home cooks to bring a piece of fine dining into their own kitchens. These recipes instructed readers to slice potatoes as thin as a shilling before frying them crisp. Housewives, armed with sharp knives and cast-iron pans, gamely attempted to recreate the magic, though one suspects that not every batch achieved the same golden crunch. Still, the fact that it had moved from restaurant novelty to household experiment was proof of its rising popularity. Interestingly, the potato chip's early audience wasn't the masses just yet. It was still considered something of a delicacy, closely tied to its Saratoga Springs origins. This was a food that traveled by word of mouth, carried home in the memories of vacationers who spoke of the experience with a kind of reverent delight. And because it wasn't yet mass-produced, part of the appeal was exclusivity. If you'd eaten a Saratoga chip, you had bragging rights. It wasn't just a snack, it was a story. It's also worth noting how perfectly the potato chip fit into 19th century dining culture. Meals at fine restaurants were sprawling affairs with multiple courses and elaborate service. Between oysters, roasts, puddings, and pastries, there was room for a novelty dish that acted as a palate pleaser. The chip, with its salty crunch, offered just that. It was playful, a little unexpected, and it broke up the heaviness of Victorian dining. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this early phase is how quickly the chip's origin as a frustrated joke was forgotten. Diners weren't thinking about George Crumb's kitchen rebellion. They were too busy crunching away. The origin story might have been colorful, but the flavor was what stuck. Saratoga chips had leapt the gap from accident to institution, proving once again that society has a remarkable talent for polishing the edges off accidental inventions until they look inevitable. By the end of the 19th century, the potato chip had become entrenched in New England food culture. It was still seen as somewhat special, not the ubiquitous snack it would later become, but its destiny was already written. What began as a local gimmick in an upstate New York resort had grown into a regional craze, poised to keep spreading. The chip was about to shed its reputation as an upper-class novelty and find a much larger audience waiting. The stage was set for the potato chip's next transformation, from the dining rooms of the wealthy to the lunchboxes and pantries of everyday Americans. All it would take was one thing: moving beyond handmade batches and finding a way to make chips by the ton. By the 1920s, potato chips had gone from elite novelty to a beloved staple in restaurants, fairs, and corner stores. But there was still a major problem. Chips were fragile, fickle creatures. Sure, they were delicious when freshly fried, but try storing them in barrels or tins, and you'd end up with a stale, greasy mess that tasted more like disappointment than delight. For chips to conquer the world, they needed a hero. Enter Laura Scudder, the woman who figured out how to keep them safe, crispy, and most importantly, ready for mass snacking. Laura Scudder wasn't a chef or a fancy restaurateur. She was a California businesswoman with an unusual knack for solving practical problems. In the early 1920s, she opened a small potato chip company and quickly noticed what every chip seller already knew. Freshness didn't last. Chips were typically scooped out of barrels or tins and wrapped in paper by hand, a system that worked about as well as keeping soup in a sieve. Customers either got stale chips or crumbs, neither of which made them come back for more. Scudder's brilliance wasn't in frying the perfect potato slice. Plenty of people could already do that. Her genius lay in packaging. She instructed her employees to take sheets of wax paper, fold and iron them into individual bags, and then fill them with chips. Suddenly the potato chip had armor. The bag kept out air, moisture and dust, while also making it easier to carry chips home without scattering them all over the sidewalk. The real invention wasn't the chip. It was the ability to hide them from moisture, air and your roommate's sticky fingers. It was an unglamorous innovation, but it changed everything. Chips could now stay fresh for weeks instead of hours. Retailers could stock them without fear of selling soggy sadness. And for customers, there was the thrill of buying not just a handful of chips, but an entire sealed bag, a personal treasure chest of crunch. The ripple effects were enormous. First, the bag turned potato chips into a portable snack. No longer confined to restaurants or events, chips could travel to school lunches, picnics and road trips. You could toss a bag into your basket at the grocer and enjoy it days later. Suddenly, potato chips weren't just an occasional treat. They were on their way to becoming part of everyday life. Second, packaging meant branding. Before Scudder's bags, chips were largely anonymous. Sure, you could get Saratoga chips from a restaurant or barrel, but you rarely knew exactly who made them. With sealed bags, producers could slap on labels, logos and slogans, turning chips into a product with identity. The bag became a billboard, and soon companies were competing not only over taste, but over whose packaging looked the most appealing. Potato chips, once faceless slices of fried tuber, now had personalities. And third, Scudder's method professionalized the entire industry. Ironing wax paper into bags may sound quaint today, but in the 1920s it was cutting-edge logistics. Her idea forced competitors to up their game, and it set the stage for future packaging innovations like cellophane and eventually the crinkly plastic bags we know today. Without Scudder, there's a good chance potato chips might have remained a short-lived indulgence instead of the global empire they are now. It's worth pausing to admire the sheer practicality of her invention. We tend to glorify flashy innovations, airplanes, radios, assembly lines, but sometimes the small everyday solutions are the ones that change our habits forever. A potato chip without a bag is like a knight without armor. Brave, tasty, but doomed the moment it encounters air. Scudder didn't just sell chips, she sold security, consistency and portability. Her company grew rapidly, riding the wave of freshness she had unleashed. Scudder's packaging technique was soon copied by others, spreading across the potato chip industry, until it became the standard. What had once been an impossible problem, how to keep fried potatoes fresh, was solved by something as humble as wax paper and an iron. It's the sort of elegant solution that makes you wonder why nobody thought of it sooner, but that's the beauty of innovation. It often seems obvious in hindsight. Perhaps most importantly, Scudder's invention gave the potato chip its modern identity as the snack you could stash, share, or, let's be honest, hide for yourself. It made chips accessible to more people than ever before, no longer the domain of fine dining or lucky locals near Saratoga Springs. Chips were ready for the lunchbox, the office desk, the picnic blanket, and eventually the vending machine. From this moment on, the potato chip was unstoppable. Sealed in its protective cocoon, it was free to travel, free to multiply, and free to crunch its way into nearly every corner of American life. What George Crumb had created out of frustration, Laura Scudder had made immortal. And so the potato chip had its bag, a humble wax paper pouch that turned a fragile curiosity into a durable commodity. The snack world would never be the same again. If George Crumb's frying pan was the birthplace of the potato chip, and Laura Scudder's wax paper bag was its armor, then the 20th century was the battlefield where the chip conquered the world. What had begun as a chef's insult was about to become the one food you can find in every gas station, school cafeteria, vending machine, and regrettable midnight snack run. The secret weapon? Machines. The potato chip entered the golden age of mass production, thanks to the unstoppable march of industrialization. By the 1920s and 1930s, America had factories capable of turning out goods on a scale unthinkable in the previous century. If you could stamp, can, or bottle it, you could make a fortune. The potato chip was no exception. Early chip companies had been small operations, frying by hand in kitchens and packing with irons and wax paper. But as demand soared, those tiny kitchens gave way to full-fledged assembly lines dedicated to one thing: transforming mountains of potatoes into avalanches of chips. The genius of mechanization was that it standardized the process. No longer were chips dependent on the skill of one cook slicing thin with a steady hand. Machines could peel, slice, fry and season potatoes at a speed that left human workers in the dust. Each bag contained chips that looked more or less the same, with the same crunch and the same salty zing. Uniformity may sound dull, but in the world of snacks it was revolutionary. People wanted the chip they loved last week to taste exactly the same this week, and for the first time machines made that promise possible. The real juggernaut of this era was Herman Lay, the man who would attach his name permanently to the chip aisle. Lay was a traveling salesman in the 1930s, peddling chips out of the trunk of his car, but he had the instincts of a snack evangelist. He understood that chips weren't just food, they were convenience wrapped in crunch. By the 1940s, his company Lay's had blossomed into one of the first national potato chip brands in the United States. It was Lay who transformed the chip from a regional curiosity into a product recognized coast to coast. And it wasn't just Lay. Dozens of other regional companies sprouted up, each with their own style and loyal following, but it was the larger-scale producers who cracked the code: national distribution, consistent flavor, and aggressive advertising. The chip was no longer something you discovered at a resort or ordered at a fancy restaurant. It was a snack waiting for you at the corner store, priced to be within reach of anyone with a nickel. Advertising in this era deserves a mention because it did as much for chips as the factories did. Companies leaned into slogans that promised freshness, quality, and fun. Lay's would later coin the iconic "Betcha can't eat just one," but even earlier campaigns tapped into the addictive quality of the chip. Bags weren't sold as sustenance, they were sold as irresistible, a little indulgence you deserved between meals. Chips weren't fuel, they were pleasure, and who could resist that pitch? The result was nothing short of a snack revolution. By the mid-20th century, chips were everywhere. School children munched them with sandwiches, office workers sneaked them at desks, and soldiers overseas received them in care packages as a taste of home. They became so ingrained in the culture that they transcended class. No longer the plaything of the wealthy, chips were for everyone, from Wall Street bankers to factory workers. Few foods have achieved that level of universal appeal. Mechanization also brought scale, and with scale came price drops. Chips were cheap. For just a few cents, anyone could buy a bag, making them one of the most democratic snacks of the century. In an America recovering from depression and war, this mattered. Chips became comfort food, a small luxury that didn't break the bank. They offered crunch when the world felt uncertain. Of course, this era also laid the groundwork for the chip's darker side: mass consumption. When production moved from local kitchens to giant factories, portion sizes grew, and availability skyrocketed. Chips went from being an occasional indulgence to a constant temptation. You no longer had to go out of your way to find them. They were waiting for you at every checkout counter, daring you to resist. Spoiler: most people didn't. The golden age of chips also marked the start of fierce competition. Once you had multiple national brands, the battle wasn't just about who could make chips. It was about who could make better chips. Better taste, better freshness, better bags. Innovation became key, and the industry began pushing beyond the plain salted variety that had carried chips this far. That next leap, flavored chips, would define the mid to late 20th century. But before flavors exploded, the chips' mass production boom was the foundation. It took what George Crumb had accidentally invented in Saratoga Springs and what Laura Scudder had cleverly preserved in wax paper and multiplied it by millions. Chips became cheap, plentiful, reliable, and irresistible. By the end of the 20th century's first half, the potato chip was no longer just a snack. It was a cultural staple, woven into daily life in a way no one could have imagined back in 1853. And the machine that made them by the ton was humming happily along, ensuring that no matter where you went, a bag of chips was never far away. For a century, potato chips had lived a simple life. Slice, fry, salt, repeat. It worked. Nobody complained. But then came the 1950s, and suddenly plain salted chips weren't enough. America had survived the Great Depression, fought a world war, and invented suburbia. People were buying television sets, driving cars with fins, and dreaming of the space age. And if culture was going to get louder, flashier, and more experimental, why shouldn't snacks enter the age of the flavor explosion? The first daring step was barbecue. This smoky, tangy, slightly sweet powder shook the snack world to its core. Credit often goes to a man named Joe Spud Murphy, founder of Tato, an Irish company that in the 1950s cracked the code for seasoning chips without making them soggy. Until then, the idea of dusting fried potatoes with anything beyond salt seemed unthinkable. But Murphy's innovation changed everything. He didn't just sprinkle, he invented a way to bind seasoning to chips in a uniform, delicious coat. Imagine being the first person to bite into a chip and find that it tasted like barbecue. It was the culinary equivalent of discovering fire. In America, barbecue hit the market in the 1960s and quickly became a bestseller. It fit perfectly into a nation already obsessed with cookouts, backyard grilling, and the aroma of smoky ribs. Chips had found their second personality, and it was bold. From there, the floodgates opened. Sour cream and onion arrived, offering a tangy, creamy, slightly herby punch that felt fancier than a mere sprinkle of salt. Cheese-flavored chips followed, proof that humanity would never pass up an opportunity to eat something that tasted like melted dairy in powdered form. Each new flavor seemed to push the boundary of what a chip could be. No longer a blank canvas of fried potato, chips became edible art experiments, and the world was the gallery. Some flavors were wild successes, others were, let's just say, brave attempts. Dill pickle found a devoted cult following, while roast chicken-flavored chips made waves in the UK, baffling anyone who wondered why their snack suddenly tasted like Sunday dinner. Across the globe, chips became cultural ambassadors. Japan leaned into seaweed and wasabi. Canada unleashed all dressed, a Frankenstein's monster of flavor that somehow combined barbecue, sour cream, and vinegar. Thailand threw in shrimp and crab flavors for good measure. At this point, it seemed like the only limit was human imagination and consumer tolerance. What's fascinating is how these flavors weren't just accidents of whimsy. They reflected cultural shifts and regional tastes. Barbecue resonated with American backyard culture. Sour cream and onion echoed the mid-century boom of dairy-based dips at cocktail parties. Cheese aligned with America's love affair with processed dairy products. Hello, Velveeta. Each seasoning told a story not just of food science, but of society. Behind the scenes, flavor innovation was a serious science. Food technologists, yes, there are people whose full-time job is to make powdered flavor stick to fried potatoes, spent careers perfecting ratios of salt, sugar, fat, and spice. The challenge wasn't just creating a flavor, but making it uniform and shelf-stable. Nobody wants the first chip in the bag to taste like a campfire and the last to taste like disappointment. The industry developed spray drying, encapsulation, and other methods to make powders that clung like magic dust. Somewhere out there was indeed a scientist whose entire career was dedicated to sprinkling powder on fried potatoes until people clapped. Advertising also helped propel flavored chips into the mainstream. No longer content with saying fresh and crispy, brands pitched boldness. Turn up the flavor, dare to try. Chips became adventure snacks, the thing you grabbed when you wanted something different, something exciting, something that promised to be more than just fried starch. They were marketed as fun, as social, as the perfect party sidekick. If plain salted chips were your reliable old friend, flavored chips were the loud, attention-grabbing guest who showed up in neon pants. By the late 20th century, the chip aisle had become a carnival of color and variety. Shelves once devoted to one or two styles now held dozens of bags, each shouting for attention in crinkly packaging. For consumers, it was both exhilarating and paralyzing. Do you stick with barbecue or take a gamble on jalapeno cheddar? Is sour cream and onion still cool? Or is it time to move on to salt and vinegar? Suddenly, buying chips became less about satisfying hunger and more about expressing personality. This flavor arms race continues to this day. Every year, companies release limited edition flavors ranging from inspired to absurd: lobster bisque, cappuccino, even Thanksgiving dinner in a chip. Some stick around, most vanish after confusing a few brave souls, but the legacy of the flavor explosion is undeniable. Chips are no longer bound to simplicity. They are vehicles for experimentation, constantly reinventing themselves to capture our restless palates. And so, from the smoky depths of barbecue to the tangy zing of sour cream, the potato chip became not just a snack, but a kaleidoscope of culinary possibility. One humble tuber, sliced thin and fried, had evolved into an entire universe of taste. Potato chips are no longer just food. They are a global passport, a cultural translator, and a unifying guilty pleasure. If you want to understand a country, forget history books, check its chip aisle. There you'll find the nation's flavor preferences, its quirks, and its unapologetic willingness to dust fried potatoes with things that should probably never be dusted on fried potatoes. Let's start with the basics. Chips are everywhere. Every corner of the globe has claimed them, adapted them, and turned them into something uniquely theirs. In Japan, you'll find seaweed, wasabi, and even octopus-flavored chips. They don't just want chips to taste like dinner, they want them to taste like sushi night. Hungary leans hard into paprika, their national spice, because nothing says Hungarian pride like potatoes that stain your fingers bright red. In India, masala-flavored chips reign supreme, bursting with spice blends so complex that your tongue will need a map to navigate them. In the UK, roast beef and prawn cocktail flavors sit proudly on shelves, a reminder that the British will happily condense a three-course meal into a snack bag. America, of course, has gone for quantity. The US chip aisle isn't a shelf, it's a football field of choice, featuring classics like sour cream and onion, alongside bizarre experiments like fried pickles or cheeseburger chips. Somewhere, a boardroom full of snack executives is brainstorming whether pumpkin spice potato chips might be the next big hit. The only guarantee is that someone somewhere will buy them just to see how bad they taste. What's striking is how chips have become cultural ambassadors. They travel better than people. Wherever they go, they adapt to local tastes while keeping the universal language of crunch. In Mexico, chips covered in chili and lime are a zesty, fiery treat. In Canada, the iconic all-dressed flavor somehow manages to taste like everything and nothing at the same time. Yet Canadians swear by it. In Thailand, crab curry chips proudly wave the banner of seafood-loving cuisine. Chips have become more than food. They're edible postcards from different corners of the world. But of course, with global popularity comes global scrutiny. Chips sit right at the center of modern debates about health. Nutritionists wag their fingers at them for being high in fat, salt, and calories. Governments slap warning labels on bags. Diet trends try to banish them. And yet the chip aisle never empties. Why? Because chips live in that sweet spot of human weakness. They're cheap, they're everywhere, and once you open the bag, you're not just eating a handful, you're eating until you hit the bottom and question your life choices. Chips also highlight the eternal human contradiction. We demand healthier foods while simultaneously demanding flavors like extra cheesy bacon ranch explosion. Food companies try to appease us with baked chips, low-fat chips, even kale chips. But let's be honest, no one has ever cried tears of joy over kale chips. The good news? Potato chips unite the world. The bad news? They also unite us in needing bigger pants. On the environmental side, chips have sparked debates too. The packaging, usually shiny, crinkly, indestructible plastic, has been criticized for being as immortal as the pyramids. Efforts are being made toward compostable bags and more sustainable production. But the irony is that even as consumers demand eco-friendly solutions, they also complain loudly when their chips aren't perfectly crispy. Apparently, we're willing to save the planet as long as it doesn't cost us the crunch. And then there's the future. What comes next for the humble chip? For one, technology is stepping in. Artificial intelligence and flavor science are teaming up to invent new blends. Imagine a future where you can order chips custom designed for your taste buds. Spicy on Tuesdays, sweet on Fridays, and mystery flavor roulette for weekends. Virtual reality might not make us live inside a bag of chips, but give snack marketing departments enough caffeine and they'll find a way. Meanwhile, global chip giants like Lay's, Pringles, and regional powerhouses will keep pushing boundaries. Expect more limited edition runs designed to spark social media buzz. Holiday stuffing flavor, cosmic blueberry barbecue, or flavor inspired by your favorite celebrity. If people will buy bottled water with a pop star's name on it, they'll buy chips flavored after them too. Ultimately, potato chips today are more than just a snack. They're a mirror of globalization, a battlefield of health versus indulgence, and proof of humanity's endless appetite for salty, crunchy joy. From Andes potatoes to Saratoga spite, from barrels of staleness to bags of engineered flavors, chips have gone everywhere and become everything. So where do we go from here? The answer is probably not towards moderation. Chips will continue to evolve, multiply, and dominate snack culture. They'll keep uniting families at movie nights, fueling road trips and filling lunchboxes. They'll keep inspiring strange new flavors and raising eyebrows across continents. And every time you crunch down on one, remember, you're not just eating a fried potato slice. You're participating in a centuries-long story of agriculture, invention, globalization, and human weakness. The potato chip is proof that sometimes the pettiest accidents create the most enduring legacies. The future may bring healthier foods, new technologies, and bold culinary experiments, but as long as there are potatoes, oil, and the human desire for something salty, there will always be chips, uniting us in crunch, one guilty handful at a time.